Okay. Well, we are in session 11 of our review of the book of Genesis. And it's in this particular case, we're going to be talking about Genesis chapter 6 and the days of Noah. It may surprise you to see us, out of 24 sessions, spend a full session just on chapter 6. And there's some reasons I'm doing that. There are a number of places in the Bible where there are passages that are controversial. There's several different views, and what we try to do is present the different views so you can do your own homework and come to your own conclusion. And we'll do that this time, but I want to mention something that's different about this particular chapter, because I'm going to suggest to you that 9 out of 10 pastors are confused about Genesis chapter 6. And so we're going to move into an area that's kind of technical in some respects. I used to regard it as just a peripheral, kind of interesting, but peripheral issue. But as the years have gone by, and as I've done more research, I was startled to discover that understanding this chapter is foundational to understanding most of the Old Testament, as well as prophecy. It's not just a part of the misty chapters of early Genesis. It is very foundational to understanding the rest of the Bible. So we're going to focus on this. And I want to remind you what Edmund Spencer said. We bring this up every once in a while. There is a principle which is a bar against all information. It's a proof against all argument, which cannot fail to keep man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is condemnation before investigation. What I'm going to ask you to do as we go into this session tonight is to set aside whatever you may have been taught or whatever you believe about chapter 6 and try to look at it with fresh eyes and try to hear what the text is saying. And my goal is not to sell you a particular view. My goal is to equip you to do your own homework, to do your own digging, and come to your own conclusions. So the same concept is in Proverbs 18:13. He that answereth a matter before he heareth it is a folly and a shame unto him. So set aside what prejudices you may have about these strange things that are going to go on in chapter 6 of Genesis. And let's try to approach it openly and with an inquiring mind. And what I used to do all the time is always have you put at the top of your notepad my trademark, Acts 17:11. And that's where Luke tells you, don't believe anything Chuck Missler tells you, but receive the word of God with all openness of mind, yet search the scriptures daily to prove whether those things be so. And I use that, for 30 years I've used that as a trademark, and it applies no more emphatically than it does here. So we're going to talk about the biblical view of the days of Noah. That's a phrase that Jesus used, and we want to understand what it really meant. You may recall that 4 disciples came to Jesus privately. Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, Peter's brother, came to Jesus. He happened to be sitting on the Mount of Olives, so many people call his response to their questions the Olivet Discourse. And it's recorded in 3 places, Matthew 24 and 25, Mark 13, and Luke 21 and 22. And we'll look at the Matthew account. Since Matthew took shorthand, he had to. He was a tax customs official. That was your job requirement. His gospel it has most of these taken down in verbatim. But in that discussion that Jesus, in responding to their question about his second coming, he opened his discussion and he closed his discussion, 2-chapter discussion, with the admonition, take heed that no man deceive you. So you want to have your guard up on this one. But when you get down to verse 37 of Matthew 24, Jesus makes an interesting remark. He says, but as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. The whole passage has to do with his second coming. And this is Matthew 24. In a couple of chapters, he's going to be crucified. And that crucifixion was not a tragedy. It was an achievement. the details of which were laid down in Genesis 3, and the entire Bible focuses on that cross. But as he's preparing his disciples for his departure and reminding them that he is coming back and talking the details about his second coming, among the things he remarks, he refers to the days of Noah. And we don't understand what he's talking about, because most of us don't have any idea. We have no idea what the days of Noah were really like. Well, it was a day of great sinfulness. Indeed it was. But if that's all there was, we better get some life jackets. Right? Okay. So what does that mean as part of the question? Well, we're going to explore. Genesis chapter 6 is preparatory to the ark and the flood and all of that. Most of us know all of it. How many of you know about Noah? Oh, you've heard of Noah before? About 80%, huh? Okay. I'm kidding, of course, but the ark and all of that will be chapter 7, 8, and 9. 7 and 8, actually, and then 9 at the end of it. So we're going to focus, though, on chapter 6 tonight, particularly, because we need to understand that, because there are some conditions that will impact your understanding of almost everything else in the Old Testament, and thus the prophecies. So Genesis chapter 6, verse 1 and 2. Now, the first thing I want you to notice before we get in this, I want you to notice verse 1 and 2 are a single sentence. It's amazing how much confusion has been generated by splitting that single sentence into the two verses. Genesis 6, verse 1 and 2. It came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Well, the first thing it hits us is sons of God. What does that phrase really mean? The sons of God. You want you to notice when men began to multiply, that's men in general. No particular subset, we're just men multiplied on the face of the earth, and they had daughters. We're talking daughters in general. We're not talking about a specific group of daughters. We're born of them, that the sons of God, whoever they were, we'll come back to that, saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, they were attractive. I assume that was a general attribution. And they took them wives of all which they chose. That's kind of a strange phrase, by the way, in the Hebrew especially. It implies that the wives didn't have much choice about it. They took them wives of all which they chose. And so now, what about this word, sons of God? In the Hebrew, it's Bnei Ha-Elohim, sons of God. But it's a phrase, to understand what it means, we need to examine the rest of the Bible. And you'll discover something interesting. That phrase is used of a direct creation of God. Okay, what did that include? Adam was a son of God. He was a direct creation of God. He fell, become sinful. You and I, as natural-born sons and daughters, are sons and daughters of Adam in the natural. We have a genetic defect that's called sin. Therefore, we die. Well, babies are innocent. No, they die also. See, even though they may be given certain allowances by God until they get the age of accountability, they also have a genetic defect called sin. We're sons of Adam, not sons of God. The term son of God in the Scripture is always used of a direct creation of God. That includes Adam, and it includes the angels. In fact, that particular phrase, if you search the entire Old Testament in the Hebrew, it's always used of angels. There are some similar passages used slightly differently, but that particular term we maintain is a technical term referring to angels. Now, I might mention something so you don't get confused. When you get to the Gospel of John, 1 John 11 and 12, speaking of Jesus Christ, he came unto his own, Israel, but his own received him not. But as many as did receive him, to them gave he the power to be what? Become the sons of God, and have life through his name. So the point is, that's why, and that gets explained in John chapter, that's in John 1. John 3, he explains it. There is a new birth involved. That's not a figure of speech. There's actually a creative event that takes place when you receive Jesus Christ. That's why it's called a new birth. And that's why you are a new creature. You are then a direct creation of God, if you're a believer. And those aren't just idioms of spiritual philosophy or something. They are very, very real events. And if it happens, your life will be changed after that. It'll bear fruit. If there's no fruit, then you've got a problem. But let's move on. So the sons of God refer to angels. Well, this leads then to a pretty weird set of views about this chapter. They are views that are not taught in most seminaries. I remember when we published some of our books and stuff, I got calls from vice presidents of major publishing companies that were angry, not at me, but to realize that they'd graduated from seminary, in this particular case, and had never been even taught this view. It's not like, I'm going to show you both views in a minute, but there's two views. These are the two views, take your pick. Most people had never been taught or taken seriously the view I'm going to show you. The sons of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim. It always is used of angels in the Old Testament. In Job 3 times, Job 1:6, 2:1, and 38:7. In Luke 20, verse 36 is the equivalent emphasis. There's a book called the Book of Enoch. It's not part of the Bible. It's not regarded as an authentic source. It is named after what may have been at one time an authentic source that's been lost, but it's a collection of views. But it's a very valuable book. It emerged about the 2nd century before Christ, and what makes it valuable is not its content, because it's not inspired, but it's very useful for grammar and vocabulary, because it's Hebrew, 2 centuries before Christ, and it deals with these issues. And it details this kind of thing. And so don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting the Book of Enoch is inspired literature. I am saying it's a useful reference point to understand the grammar and the vocabulary of that day. But even more so is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint. 3 centuries before Christ's ministry, the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek. And we have 4 copies of that. It's called the Septuagint, a fancy word for 70. 70 scholars were gathered in the literary center of the world called Alexandria in Egypt, and spent 15 years, from 285 to 270, translating the Old Testament into Greek. Now, what makes that so valuable is Greek is a very precise language. Incredibly. Probably no language has ever come along as precise as Greek. Every verb has to fit 5 conditions, and so forth. In the Septuagint translates this clearly as angels. And now it was done by the greatest Hebrew scholars 3 centuries before Christ's birth. So I'm going to suggest that at least in some of these cases, it's very authoritative. Now, it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born of them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair. And now we get to, we talked about B'nai Ha-Elohim, sons of God. The daughters of men, I want you to notice what that is, Banath Adam in the Hebrew. The view that is taught by most seminaries is that, well, that really refers to the daughters of Cain. And they try to create a situation that the sons of God referred to the descendants of Seth, and the daughters were of Cain, and they weren't supposed to intermarry, and that's what's involved here. I'll deal with that in more detail in a minute, but I want you to notice that's not what the text says. It's the sons of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim, saw the Banath Adam, that is the daughters of Adam. So these are general girls, not girls of a particular, of either of Cain or Abel or Seth or whatever. Are you with me? Okay. Now when you get down to verse 4, it says there were Nephilim in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children unto them. The same became the Hagibarim, the mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. There were Nephilim. That's the Hebrew word. Unfortunately, it's translated as giants in many English translations. They did happen to be giants, but that's not what the word means. The word in the Hebrew is Nephilim. And it's important to understand this word. It comes from a root meaning Nephal, the fallen ones. The verb Nephal in the Hebrew is to fall or be cast down, to fall away, or desert. If you're a deserter, or if so forth, the verb is Nephal. Nephilim are the fallen ones. So there were fallen ones. Now what on earth are they? Also in that verse was the Hagibarim, the mighty ones. And these Nephilim, in other words, when these angels, now these are fallen angels, these are bad guys, you'll see in a minute. When they found some way to procreate with human women, they gave birth to hybrids. They were different than either of their parents because they were part human and part not human. And these were the Nephilim. And this idea shocks many people. It's very disturbing to many people, but let's try to keep an open mind and see what the Scripture says and see what implications it has in our understanding, not just of the flood of Noah, but the rest of the Old Testament. Now, again, the Septuagint takes this word, Nephilim, and treats it, translated as gigantes. Because it's gigantes, when they translated from the Septuagint to the English, they called them giants. It sounded like giants. That's not what the word means, by the way, but you can understand why they did that. They really transliterated. So they translated in most English Bibles as giants. The word comes from gigos, which means earthborn. And it's the same word that they use in Greek mythology for titans. Titans in Greek mythology were the offspring of gods, Greek gods, cohabiting with women. They were the demigods, half god, half man. Titans, Atlas, Hercules, these were in mythology these kinds of creatures. So that's what the word used for. The word genea means to breed or be of a certain kind. And the English word genes or genetics comes from the same Greek root. And there may be a linkage here that may surprise you that we'll get into this a little bit. Well, Genesis 3 said, "And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. So from this announcement, there's 120 years before the big event, which we'll talk about. And then verse 4, there were giants in the earth in those days. That's the way it would be in your Bible. The word is Nephilim. We're going to talk a lot about Nephilim in the earth in those days. And notice this, and also after that, these things occurred in those days, and they gave rise to the flood. But there's a phrase in here we're going to come back to later. And also after that, it didn't end with the flood. It was so universal that the flood dealt with it. But we're going to discover it wasn't limited to that. There's been some incidents since then. Anyway, when the sons of God, the Benaiah Elohim, came in unto the Benoth Adam, and they bare children unto them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. Now, when you get down to verse 9, we're going to be dealing with some other verses here in a minute, but I want to look ahead a little bit. In verse 9 of chapter 6, there is a remark about Noah that unless you're very careful, unless you do some exegetical homework, you'll miss the meaning of it. It says, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. Now here's that phrase again. We ran into that phrase with Enoch, didn't we? Noah walked with God. He was a just man. That doesn't mean he was sinless, but it does mean he was righteous before God because he was faithful and obedient. But there's a phrase in here that most people miss. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. And Noah walked with God. Now that word perfect in the Hebrew is tamim. It always refers to a physical blemish. Tamim means without a blemish, sound, healthful, without spot. Unblemished, in other words, unimpaired. Well, wait a minute. What does it mean when it says that his genealogy was unimpaired? You see, it wasn't tainted by these goings-on with these fallen angels. The human race was getting contaminated. In fact, I believe it was Satan's strategy to contaminate the human race to prevent a Redeemer that was promised in Genesis 3. But Noah is an exception. He may not have been the only exception, but what was distinctive with Noah and his gang is that they were untainted by these goings-on of the Nephilim, of the fallen angels. Now you say, gee, this sounds pretty weird stuff, Chuck. You're saying that these angels cohabited with women, and gave birth to hybrids. Well, if that's a pretty weird idea. But if it's true, it's going to be confirmed in at least 2 places elsewhere in the Bible, right? 2 or 3 witnesses the law requires. If you turn to Jude, verse 6 and 7, that's the book just before the book of Revelation, the New Testament. Jude is making an argument that I'm not going to try to recreate here to take the time, but in his argument, he makes reference in verse 6 of this little book. He says, "And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of that great day." So Jude here, Jude's the brother of Jesus Christ. He's writing this little short epistle. He's speaking of angels that did something wrong. They kept not their first estate, but they left their own habitation. I'll come back to that word in a minute. He hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of their great day. Then he goes on to amplify this for us in verse 7. He says, "Even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them, in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire." So here we have an allusion by Jude that these angels, which apparently went after strange flesh, which God, because of that, they are reserved in everlasting chains and under darkness. So they're given a very special treatment. Well, this left their own habitation, going after strange flesh. These are angels it's talking about here. The word habitation, here's another technicality. You'll find, you won't find this in most textbooks, but let me just give the word in the Greek in the habitation is okaterion. It only occurs twice in the New Testament. Here in Jude, and in 2 Corinthians 5:2. What does this word okaterion mean? It means habitation, like a habit or a habitation. Well, it's used only twice in the Bible. In Jude 6, we just read, it's what these angels left. These angels left their habitation. Here it says, in a positive sense, it's speaking of the believer. "For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our," and the same word, okaterion, "which is from heaven." When we put this together, the angels that sinned shed the place they were living in, the body they were living in order to participate in this sin with human beings. That term is the body that you and I aspire to. We would use the term resurrection body. See, for in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our habit or habitation, house, which is from heaven. You and I, as believers, aspire to having an okaterion, which is given to us by God. It's our immortal bodies. But that term is what these angels shed in order to participate in this mischief in Genesis 6. Let's look at another place. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4 and 5. Peter makes a reference to the same thing again. He says, "For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to Tartarus," I'll come back to that word, "and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah," and then he goes on. So Peter does 2 things here. He introduces to a word Tartarus, I'll come back to, but he also links these angels that sinned with the days of Noah. See, God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down, delivered them into chains of darkness, reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah, and he goes on to talk about Noah and the ark and all that business. Now, he uses the word Tartarus. That word does not occur anywhere else in the Bible. It's translated hell in your English Bible. But what kind of a hell is it? The word Tartarus in the Greek is widely used in Greek, not in biblical Greek, but in Greek. Tartarus is the Greek term for a dark abode of woe. In fact, it's considered the pit of darkness in the unseen world. In Homer's Iliad, that classic Greek thing, it is rendered as it is as far below Hades as the earth is below heaven. What does that mean? I don't know, but I don't want to go there. Okay. Now, it's very possible that it might be synonymous with the abuso. That's speculation. We're not sure. We'll see. But that's another story. Now, what's interesting about this weird view that I'm sharing with you about Genesis 6, we'll discover that that same idea is embodied in the myths and legends of every culture, ancient culture on the planet Earth. We're best known as the Greek Titans. The Greek mythology speaks of these demigods that are partly terrestrial, partly celestial. They apparently rebelled against their father Uranus, and after a prolonged contest, they were defeated by Zeus and condemned into Tartarus. Again, that's where the word comes from. And by the way, it's interesting that Zeus is not the creator. I've been doing a little study in Greek mythology. I'm fascinated. You know, I always thought, well, Zeus is their name for God. Not exactly, because Zeus is still not the creator. So it's interesting. They don't reach that far in their thing. Anyway, here's pictures as Zeus is often rendered, who is the top guru here. And then you have Hercules. You all heard about Hercules. You all heard about Atlas. In the Greek mythology, these would be in the Hebrew called Nephilim. They were offspring of human mothers and Greek mythological gods as parents. Now, if you study ancient legends, you'll discover the most earliest culture. Sumer has these legends. Assyria, Egypt, Incas, Mayan, Gilgamesh in Babylon, Persia, Greece, of course. Most of us are familiar with the Greek versions of this mythology. India, Bolivia, South Sea. Even the American Indians speak of the star people that came down and so forth. And I came across a fascinating reference in a book that was considered at the time very reliable, the autobiography of William Cody, commonly known as Buffalo Bill. And if you look at Buffalo Bill's autobiography, Colonel William F. Cody in 1920, there's a paragraph, I put part of it in here. He says, while we were in the Sandhills scouting the Niobrara country, the Pawnee Indians brought into camp some very large bones, one of which the surgeon of the expedition pronounced to be the thigh bone of a human being. The Indians said the bones were those of a race of people who long ago had lived in that country. They said these people were 3 times the size of a man of the present day, and they were so swift and strong that they could run by the side of a buffalo, and taking the animal in one arm could tear off a leg and eat it as they ran. The bone was too big, they didn't have wagons, so they didn't keep it. So he recorded it in his journal. So I don't know what to make of that, but I think it's interesting. You'll discover, if you study Indian lore, that the Indians were terrified of the 6-fingered people. That's why when they met a stranger, they held up the hand to prove they only had 5 fingers. This how business is Hollywood, but the idea of greeting a stranger with your hand so you could count fingers. You'll find that recorded in the pictoglyphs in Chaca, New Mexico, among other places. Anyway, moving on. There is a book that I have a extensive library, but someone was kind enough to add this to it, by Stephen Quayle, which is an encyclopedia of giants, all relating to Genesis 6 and other subjects. And this came out in 2002. I'm just giving you a couple of snapshots. It's amazing. He has a catalog here of hundreds of giants in human history that we have records of or pictures of. Here's a couple of guys. You wouldn't want to meet them in a dark alley, would you? Here's a guy 9 foot 4 inches, Makhnoff and Chiquita. These are, of course, used in shows and stuff back in the turn of the century. Here's a gal by the name of Lady Amma. She was 22 years old, 7 foot 9 inches, with 2 elder sisters. You notice this, one of them is very small. She ends up marrying a Chinese dwarf. These are from the late 19th century. Here's Captain Martin Van Buren and his wife, Mrs. Ann Bates. Both of them about 8 feet tall. She was actually a little taller than he was, or very close to it. He was born in Kentucky in 1847, and they, of course, were on exhibit throughout Europe, but these pictures were part of the promotion and so forth. I could go on, but just to give you some feel, there are records of giant people, 10, 13 feet kinds of people, and skeletons, hundreds of them. It's one part of Stephen Quayle's book highlights the fact that for strange reasons, they always get covered up. You really have to do some digging to get the records and stuff. He spent 30 years pulling his encyclopedia together. But there's a genetic discovery I want to share with you. Scientists at Johns Hopkins University have discovered that there's a gene in mice which controls growth. It's called GDF8. In other words, growth differentiation factor 8. Disrupting GDF8 will result in super mice that are 2 to 3 times larger and much stronger than normal mice. And this was published in Nature, a reputable journal, in April 30th of 1997. So it's interesting to me, don't confuse hormonal growth. Some people are large because of hormones, but when they get bigger, they get weaker. We're talking about a genetic difference here, and also, I'm assuming, a genetic difference in the Nephilim. You follow me? Because the Nephilim become supermen, very large and very terrifying. And so now it's interesting, by the way, speaking of genetics here now, it's interesting, in the Bible, there's the death penalty for lying with a beast, sleeping with an animal, in the sexual sense. If a woman lies with a beast, both shall be killed, not only the beast, but the woman. That's in Leviticus 20, verses 15 and 16. I'll give you an example. This all deals with confusion. And one of the questions we can ponder as we drive home tonight, does the genetic transfers of human DNA into animals suggest that we are entering the period which Jesus likened to the days of Noah? This genetic thing is going to get more complicated, especially as we cross species lines. We're introducing confusion. We're going to open the door for diseases that we have no answer to, and so forth. And so we're entering a very nightmarish era. And that's exactly what Revelation talks about in terms of Revelation chapter 6 and so on. Well, it's interesting, as you travel the ancient world, you find these gods or super gods modeled in all the ancient writings. They have the flying god Ashur. And this guy shows up everywhere, on pyramids, on walls. As you go through Egypt, he's on all the thresholds. As you go up there, you see it right in the middle of these winged things. And of course, some people feel that these may be allusions to flying saucers and what have you. And so we won't get into that here. We did publish a book called Alien Encounters, which deals with this and explores the possibility that it may have some relationship to the increasing occurrence of UFOs and so on. But there is a different view. The view I'm going to show you now is the way this material is classically taught in most seminaries. And as a result, most pastors, I'll show you some exciting exceptions, but I'm talking about conservative pastors now. I'm talking about the general run-of-the-mill pastors. They talk about Genesis 6 in terms of what's called the line of Seth. And the view is that the sons of God, that phrase, refers to Seth, the leadership of Seth. Seth, they paint this picture. Abel's been killed by Cain, right? Then there comes Seth. Well, Cain's the bad guy, Seth's the good guy, is the fabric they try to create. And the sons of God is a phrase, they argue, that refers to the Sethite leadership. By the way, there's not a scrap of biblical reference that supports this. This is just the way it's taught. The daughters of Adam really means the daughters of Cain. And the big mistake that was made, presumably, is that the Sethite leadership commingled with the daughters of Cain, and that was supposed to be a no-no. And there's some problems with that. The sin in this was a failure to maintain separation. There's a problem with this because separation isn't called for until chapter 11. They weren't told to keep separate, by the way, so this is all very contrived. But even when you go through this, the other question is, well then, fine, if you got believers and unbelievers marrying, who are these Nephilim? When a believer and an unbeliever get married and have children, the children turn out to be monsters, but they're not monstrous. They're not genetically distinctive. You with me? You see the difference? These Nephilim are genetically distinctive. And this whole idea of the line of Seth emerged in the 5th century. Celsus and Julian the Apostate used the traditional belief of the angel view of Genesis 6 to attack Christianity, because it's a weird idea. A lot of people rebel at this idea. Angels having, it's unpleasant. So a guy by the name of Julius Africanus resorted to the Sethite theory as a more comfortable way with dealing with the text. He contrived this idea. Well, what it really means is this, It doesn't mean what it says. It means that it's really referring to such and so. And of course, then Cyril of Alexandria used it to repudiate the Orthodox position, because leaning on Africanus. But the real mistake came when Augustine embraced the Sethite view, and because he did, and because of his stature, it became the Orthodox view. The lines of Seth is the view that's, even to this day, still taught about this passage. And thus it became part of the Catholic Church, and it prevailed through the Middle Ages. And most Protestant denominations that derived from the Reformation they dragged this baggage along without re-examining it. And so it's commonly taught today. When I'm teaching you here, you're going to have to do some digging to even come across what's called the angel view of Genesis 6. But the text itself, the sons of God is never used of believers in the Old Testament. That's what the Sethite view would require. Seth was not God, Cain was not Adam. These were daughters of Adam, not daughters of Cain, right? So forth. And there's no mention of daughters of Elohim. There's sons of God, but there aren't daughters. Are there no daughters of Elohim? What's the point? And there's also some grammatical problems with that I won't bore you with. That gets technical, so we'll move on. And the lines were separated in Genesis 11. That's when that was imposed upon Isaac, not for Ishmael or anybody else, just on Isaac. By the way, if the Sethites were the good guys, right, that's the theory of the Seth view, why did they drown in the flood? You see, all flesh was corrupted according to Genesis 6, verse 12. So this idea of the Sethite view, as it's called, if you start examining it from a textual basis, falls apart, makes no sense. Now, the inferred godliness of Seth is suspect because who was his son? Remember, see, only Enoch and Noah's 8 were spared. Noah and his 3 sons, that's 4 people, and their 4 wives. 8 people in that ark. Enoch's pulled out ahead of time. Those 8 are miraculously preserved in the ark. Well, where are the Sethites if they're such good guys? Remember, the Nephilim took wives as they chose. And why did the Sethites perish in the flood? And by the way, something else you may recall from last session, Enosh, which was Seth's son, is the guy that initiated the defiance of God. He's the first apostate. That last verse in chapter 4 is mistranslated. In the days of Enosh, men began to call upon the name of the Lord. That's mistranslated. They began to defy, call upon idols and so forth. Very important translation issue we talked about last time. Men began to profane the name of the Lord, according in Genesis 4:26. That's the Targum of Angelos, which is in the Jewish community regarded as the translation. The Targum of Jonathan, Kimchi, Rashi, and the other rabbinical scholars all agree. Jerome agrees. Maimonides, which is probably the most venerated of the Hebrew sages of the 12th century, in his commentary on the Mishnah. The point is the ancient Hebrew sages understood the angel view. That's the main point I'm getting here. And daughters of Cain is the concept. There's not a subset of the daughters of Adam. Cainites were not necessarily godless. Remember, Cain, yes, he murdered his brother, but remember how that chapter ends with his genealogy. He names his son with the name of God in it. He was a repentant believer. Yes, he did murder, and yes, he's suffering for it, but his children were God-fearing, apparently, at least some of them. And the other question about the daughters of Seth that they don't have an answer for, were the daughters of Seth so unattractive? Why are the Sethite leadership going after daughters of Cain? What's wrong with the daughters of Seth? Are they ugly, or what's the problem? Anyway, but the unnatural offspring is the final nail in the coffin of the Sethite thing, the supernatural offering. The text implies that the offering, the Nephilim, were the mighty men, the Hagabarim. And to give you an example of one is Goliath. He was a descendant of Anak. Anak was one of the Nephilim. And of course, this whole issue of no chromosomes among the Sethites. There were no women of renown, men of renown, right? No women of renown. And so and then the other question is, what made Noah's genealogy so distinctive that it gets a mention in verse 9? Because it was unblemished. These others were blemished. Now, the New Testament, as I point out, confirms this 3 times. In Jude 6 and 7, we looked at that. 1 Peter 3, 19 and 20, and 2 Peter 2, verses 4 and 5. So we went through those. Now, the angel view before Christ is all through the traditional rabbinical literature. It's in the book of Enoch, as I mentioned before. It's the testimony of the 12 patriarchs. It's in Josephus. Josephus talks, he takes for granted the angel view in his writings. And the Septuagint, as I mentioned. So if you look at the record that we would regard as useful, it clearly, it knows no other view than really the angel view. The church fathers in the early church, Philo of Alexandria, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Athenagoras, Tertullian, Lactantius, and Ambrose is missing. It should be Ambrose. And Julian. Let's talk about modern day. If you read the writings of G.H. Pember, M.R. DeHaan, C.H. McIntosh, Delitzsch, Kyle and Delitzsch are the authoritative commentaries in the Old Testament in most seminary libraries. Gaebelein, Arthur W. Pink, Donald Gray Barnhouse, Henry Morris down in San Diego, Merrill Unger, expert on demonology. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, one of the greatest contemporary Jewish scholars knows his Bible. And Hal Lindsey, Chuck Smith. I had a guy that didn't really buy this, a good friend of mine, is a guy by the name of Tim LaHaye. And Tim and I used to have some discussions, and he wouldn't fight me on it. He just couldn't quite. I got a letter from him just a couple of days ago. The subject of the letter was some other thing. He was congratulating us on the verdict that we got in that trial and so forth. But he also, in a letter, says, Chuck, you finally convinced me, because he's apparently, for some other reasons, he's doing some research and some writing, and he's got all our tapes. He's gone through them 3 times. And he finally, in his letter, he says, you finally convinced me on the angels of Genesis 6. And so I could add his name here too, I suppose. But anyway. So the Sethite view is shattered by the text itself, by the inferred separation, by the inferred godliness of Sethites, the inferred Canaanite subset of the Adamites, the unnatural offspring called Nephilim, New Testament confirmations. But here is the real shocker to me. Up till now, that was my view. But as I've been doing some homework in recent years, I also realized you will not understand what happened after the flood and most of the prophecies through the Old Testament unless you understand this background. If you miss this, so I always felt, well, okay, there's 2 different views. I hold this one, they hold that one, who cares, let's go on. I discovered, no, this turns out to be important foundation to understand the rest of the Old Testament. Because you're going to run into, in the Old Testament, a term called the Rephaim. The word Repha means dead. It also means, it can mean ghost or spirit. But it's often, the Rephaim are the dead ones. But see, they're the walking dead, you'll discover. In Genesis 6:4, when we talked about the Nephilim, it says, and also after that. After the flood, we run into people called the Rephaim. Now, one of the questions that lurks behind this study will be, who built the ancient monuments? You know, the world is littered with monuments that defy explanation. Not just the Great Pyramid and Stonehenge. There are palaces and things and temples in which the rocks are the size of boxcars. And they come from hundreds of miles away. And there's all kinds of theories, but the truth is no one really knows how these things were built. And this doesn't explain it, but it begins to, there's a hint that see, the Great Pyramid at Giza is one, the Stonehenge in Britain. And there's a circle of what's known as a circle of Rephaim up in the Golan Heights. Nan and I were up there once. We got a 4x4, and we went up there. And this is an aerial, you can't tell this from the ground. When you're in the air, you realize it's a Stonehenge-type structure. It's called the Gilgal Rephaim. It's up in the Golan Heights, up near Bashan. And we're going to talk more about that as we go. There are 5 circles that involve 20-ton stones. The diameter is about 155 meters. It's dated to about 3000 BC. It's built on a flat plateau. It's only visible, you can only tell its architecture when we're getting above it. And it's about 10 miles from Ashtaroth, Karnaim. And it's in Genesis, Joshua. We won't spend a lot of time on that here. There's some other ruins. These have never been excavated, by the way, because they're up there up in the Golan, where it's tension. When we take some pictures, there were shells dropping about 1,000 yards away. Training stuff, but still. After the flood, it says also after that, we discover, you'll be introduced in Genesis 14, there's at least 4 tribes, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Horim, and the Zamzumim, that God instructs Joshua to wipe out every man, woman, and child of those certain tribes. When you read that in the Old Testament, as a New Testament reader, it's hard to relate to that. Because they are instructed not to compromise, to wipe out every man, woman, child. And you need to you won't understand that unless you realize there's a gene pool problem. When we get to Genesis 15, God is going to give Abraham, Genesis 12, 15, and 17, deals with God's covenant with Abraham, where he commits the land to Abraham. And he tells Abraham what's going to happen. You're going to go away, and your descendants will come back here after 400 years. He goes through that prophecy. Well, when God tells Abraham that, Satan suddenly knows that he's got 4 centuries to lay down a minefield. And so the mischief that led to the flood of Noah, that was worldwide, which was taken care of by the flood, that same mischief apparently was indulged in the land of Canaan to provide these giants to prevent Israel from taking its possession. Satan has always tried to oppose God's plan, and he gave that land to Israel. So in those days, he had these giants Today he's got the PLO and the UN. But let's move on. In Numbers 13, you remember when Moses sent the 12 spies out? And took Joshua and Caleb back and says, let's go get them. God's with us. But the other 10 were terrified. They said, we are as grasshoppers in their sight. Why? Verse 33 of Numbers 13, there were Nephilim in the land. That actual Hebrew word is used there. And Arba, Anak and his 7 sons were known as the sons of Anak, or the Anakim. They were encountered in Canaan. Their descendants, you will remember, one had a group of brothers. His name was Goliath, right? And so on. So these guys are 10, 13 feet tall. These are not just overgrown. These aren't basketball guys. These are different breed altogether. There was a king, Og, the king of Bashan. Up in the Golan Heights, the biblical area is called Bashan. And Og, the king of Bashan, is known in Deuteronomy 3 and Joshua 12 and elsewhere as the king of the giants. He was the king of these gigantic races that were derivative from some kind of undisclosed mischief by these angels again, Satan's emissaries. And Goliath and his 4 brothers. See, when you read all about David, and he goes across, as a kid, he's going to take on Goliath. Notice when he stops at that brook, he picks up 5 stones. How many did he need for Goliath? 1. What, the other 4 there, lack of faith? No. He was ready for all of them. Give you a whole insight to this kid. You can study the Bible from cover to cover in terms of Satan's strategy to try to thwart the plan of God. As God reveals that there's going to be a Redeemer, a seed of the woman, Satan knew he had to deal with the human race. The corruption of Adam's line was his first shot, apparently. Well, maybe Cain and Abel was part of it, but by corrupting the firstborn there. Abraham's seed, when God starts to tell Abraham, that calls Abraham, tells him the Redeemer is going to come from his seed, then Abraham allows Satan to focus his attack now, not on everybody, just on Abraham. The famine in Genesis 50 and others. When you get to Exodus, the destruction of the male line by Pharaoh, it's all part of Satan's provocation. Even after Pharaoh lets him go on Passover, he changes his mind, goes after him, right? To what? To wipe them out. Pharaoh's pursuit in Exodus 14. And then, of course, the whole population of Canaan, to prevent them from getting in there, is part of what we're going to be dealing with here. When God finally reveals that it's going to be not just through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and through the tribe of Judah, even every time God does it, allows Satan to focus. But when he reveals that it's going to be out of the house of David, in 2 Samuel 7, that allows Satan to focus his attacks on the house of David. And in the royal line, again and again and again, we find the royal kids, the heirs to the throne, are killed. There's an attempt to wipe out all the heirs, except always there's a servant that hides a baby. There's all kinds of these, all through there are these intrigues. The Arabians slew all but Azariah, who was hidden. Athaliah, she ends up killing everybody, but Joash escapes. Hezekiah is assaulted in Isaiah 36 and 38. Remember, when you get to the Persian Empire, Haman is trying to wipe out the entire Jewish race. Why? Well, it's prejudice. No, it's something more deeper than not just that simple. It's an attempt to thwart the plan of God. And you wonder, why is Satan still at it today? Because there's a prerequisite condition for the second coming of Christ. That's for Israel to repent and to ask him to return. And they will. But it'll take the tribulation to drive them to it. In the New Testament, Joseph fears when Mary's pregnant. That was punishable by death. He fears for her. Matthew 1st. Herod's attempt to killing the babes at Bethlehem. We celebrate every Christmas that comes up. That's Satan's attempt to thwart the plan of God. At Nazareth, when Jesus opens his ministry in Luke 4, they try to throw him off a cliff. Then there's storms at sea, and by the way, there's 2 of them, not just one. In Mark 4 and Luke 8, you'll discover if you study those storms, they were not, in my opinion, natural storms. Why? Because there were sailors aboard that are familiar with those waters that knew about storms, and they were terrified. That tells me something else is going on. They were supernaturally induced, I believe. And that's why Jesus rebukes the storm. Interesting. Check the words. And of course, the ultimate strategy was the cross. And all of this is summarized for you in Revelation 12. In Revelation, it's got this dramatic book, but there's a chapter set aside, chapter 12, where it reviews from the seed of the woman until the rapture. In fact, beyond the rapture. So Satan's still at it, and he's not through. What does the Golan Heights, Hebron, and the Gaza Strip have in common? You read those in the news lately? They were the areas that Joshua failed to exterminate the Rephaim in Joshua 15 and so forth. If you do a study of the book of Judges, the strongholds that failed to defeat Israel completely in the book of Judges are the parts that are colored on the map. Those are the territories that to this day are still remaining in dispute. And where's their capital? In Jericho, Bet Yaral, the house of the moon god. Interesting, isn't it? Isn't that fascinating? I think it's interesting. Then tell me demons are not territorial. There is a very, very strange verse in Psalm 22. All of us read Psalm 22. It sounds as if it was dictated first person singular by Jesus as he hung on the cross. It opens up with, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And it closes with, it's done, it's finished. And but in the middle, and we always look at that with great, it's incredible as you go through that. But right in the middle of it, there is a strange verse in verse 12. Jesus apparently saying, many bulls have compassed me. Strong bulls of Bashan have beset me round. Now, Bashan is what we call the Golan Heights, and it was well known as cattle-raising country. Bulls of Bashan was an idiom. It may be that's what he means. A bunch of cattle down there? I don't think so. I suspect, don't know this, I'm just guessing here, but I suspect this is a demonic phrase. That the bulls of Bashan is referring to something supernatural. There's another issue that surprises me that more experts, people who have really specialized in this field, have not seen the discernment. And that's the distinction between fallen angels and demons. All through the Bible we find fallen angels. We just talked a lot about them so far today. When you get the New Testament, you run into these strange things that we generally call demons. Are they equivalent or are they distinctive? There are experts, Merrill Unger being one of them, that are really, that's their world, is demonology, that don't make the distinction I'm going to suggest to you here, so you have to decide for yourself. The nature of angels. What do we know about angels? We'll go through the Bible and discover they always appear in human form. They never look like anything. They don't look like lizards or elephants. They normally look like they're in human form. It's Sodom and Gomorrah. They're always in pairs, too, usually, by the way. Sodom and Gomorrah, remember? At the resurrection, they were there, a couple of them. At the ascension, there's a couple of them, right? Always look like men, right? They spoke so you could understand them. They took men by the hand. They ate meals with them, right? Paul even admonishes you in his New Testament epistles in terms of hospitality. Many of you have entertained angels unawares. That's Paul's perception there, okay? They are capable of direct physical combat. The Passover in Egypt was accomplished by an angel doing the Lord's bidding. Angel of death is referred to in some places. One night after dinner, one angel slaughters 185,000 Syrian soldiers. I don't know how many soldiers were there. It wouldn't surprise me. There were twice that many if they slit every other throat. That's what the Turks used to do, just to scare everybody to death. You wake up in the morning and find every other, that's demoralizing to a group. Because the word gets around, see? But anyway, the slaughter of 185,000. You don't mess with angels. By the way, Jesus said they don't marry. That causes a lot of confusion. I'll come back to that. He says the angels in heaven don't marry. But angels are always referred to in the masculine. And you say, well, that's just a figure of speech. No. Study carefully Genesis 19. What the homosexuals of that city wanted Lot to deliver his guests. So I don't have to get more graphic than that. Now, in contrast to these things, when we run into demons in the New Testament, they're very different. They seem to be powerless except to the extent they can indwell someone. They apparently always seek embodiment. That's why they petitioned to go into the swine and all that at Gadara. You know the story. Jesus said, for in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God. He's referring to believers. In the reresurrection, they neither marry or given in marriage, but are as angels of God in heaven. Meaning, what he means by that is they are immortal. Someone that is mortal needs to procreate. Someone that's immortal doesn't procreate. That's his point. Now, he doesn't say, he's talking about the angels that are in heaven, the ones that are well behaved. I personally would not put any limitations on the technology available to an angel that's bent on mischief. That's my real point, I think. The word habitation, I've covered this before, the akaterion refers to the body and it was a dwelling place for the spirit. It occurs only twice. In Jude 6, which the angels disrobed, and in 2 Corinthians 5:2, the heavenly body to which we as believers long to be clothed with. And the word habitation in one place is the same as the word house in the other place. Well, let's back up a little bit and talk about warfare. When we were in Genesis 3, verse 15, we had God declaring war on Satan. He said, I'll put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. And he shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Everybody quotes this as the first link in the chain of prophecies about Jesus Christ. And that's where he gets the title, the seed of the woman. But many people miss that there's two seeds here. There's the seed of the woman, and there's the seed of the serpent. He later is called the red dragon in Revelation 12. He's the coming world leader, I call him. I don't like the term Antichrist because it's too limiting. And he has a sidekick by the name of the false prophet. So with Satan and the coming world political leader and the false prophet at his side, you've got a satanic counterfeit of a trinity. Everything Satan does is a counterfeit. And these are the forces behind the world today. And Daniel chapter 10 is your recommended study on the details of all of that. When you get to Daniel 2, and we have the famous event of Daniel 2 is by way of review. We have Babylon, Persia, Greece, then Rome in two phases. In Daniel chapter 7, it's laid out, same subject, different idioms, but again, we have those same empires. But we get to these, in Daniel 2, we have the iron mixed with clay, remember? There's all this speculation. We have, the head we know is gold, is Babylon, the silver is Persia, the brass is green, the legs are iron, but the feet are iron mixed with clay. What on earth is the clay? And I've taught this for 30 years before I realized Daniel explains who the clay is. And of course, the last two are iron, two phases of the same empire. But we know that we're heading for a world order, a world without borders. We talked about that a lot. The whole idea of these things are, and it's coming. Global government's happening for at least three reasons. The nuclear proliferation is part of it. You've got to have global governance. Terrorism is a worldwide thing. It knows no borders. But there's also the possibility that we're going to be unified in a world government for a cosmic threat. General MacArthur said that. Reagan said it 3 times in public speeches. Many people miss that. That one thing will unite this world will be a threat from the outside. But to get back to this, what is the miry clay in Daniel 2? See, it's all in Aramaic, not Hebrew. From Daniel 2 to 7 is in the Gentile language of the day, the Aramaic, not the Hebrew. Miry clay is clay made from mire or dust. It's very brittle. When you get to Daniel chapter 2, verse 43, I remember I must have read this hundreds of times over 30 years and never noticed what it said. Shame on me. And Daniel's interpreting this vision. He says, whereas thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. Whoops. Wait a minute. What did he say? See, it's a person. The clay represents some kind of people. As miry clay, they, switches to a personal pronoun, shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. In order to mingle with the seed of men, they have to be something other than the seed of men. I've had this checked by experts. That's what the Hebrew requires. Whatever they are,